Airports are meant to be exciting places full of new beginnings, where families come together and adventures start. But for Alyssa's family, this ordinary morning was about to change in a big way. Before we proceed, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Making these videos requires a lot of hard work. We'd love to hear where you're watching from, so drop a comment below. Now, let's start our adventure. After months of non-stop work, busy schedules, and school projects, they were finally heading off on a much-needed vacation to Miami. Alyssa, her husband Marcus, and their 2 kids, Noah and Zoe, had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The kids were bubbling with excitement, barely able to sit still as they chatted about the beaches they would visit and the theme parks they couldn't wait to explore. The early morning flight meant they were at the airport before dawn. Still groggy but thrilled, they passed through security and made their way to the VIP lounge. It was one of those rare splurges, something they had saved up for, knowing how chaotic airports can get. The plush chairs, free snacks, and calm atmosphere were exactly what they needed to start their vacation on the right foot. Alyssa and Marcus found a cozy corner with 2 large chairs and a small table where they could keep an eye on the kids while sipping their coffee. Noah, their 10-year-old, was already fascinated by the giant floor-to-ceiling windows, watching planes take off into the early morning light. Zoe, only 7, was sitting cross-legged on one of the chairs, deeply engrossed in a coloring book. The lounge hummed with quiet conversations and the clinking of dishes from the buffet area. Everything felt peaceful, and Alyssa allowed herself to relax, savoring the calm before the adventure of travel truly began. She exchanged a smile with Marcus, who reached for her hand, giving it a squeeze. But that calm didn't last for long. A few minutes later, a tall, middle-aged woman strode into the lounge. She wore an expensive designer coat and carried a large tote bag with a brand logo that Alyssa recognized but could never afford. The woman's presence was hard to miss, not just because of her outfit, but because of the way she carried herself. She moved through the lounge like she owned it, her nose slightly turned up, surveying the people around her as if deciding whether they were worth her time. Alyssa caught her eye for a brief second, offering a polite smile, but the woman didn't smile back. In fact, her expression hardened as she looked at Alyssa's family. It was a subtle shift, but Alyssa felt it, the way the woman's eyes lingered a moment too long, the slight curl of her lips into something that resembled disgust more than indifference. Alyssa's stomach tightened, though she tried to brush it off. After all, they were here to enjoy themselves, not worry about what other people thought. The woman made her way to the front desk where a lounge attendant stood, busy with paperwork. Alyssa didn't pay much attention at first, focusing instead on keeping Zoe's juice box from tipping over. But when she heard a voice, loud enough to catch her ear but low enough to suggest it wasn't meant to be overheard, she glanced up. "I'm sorry, but I'm just wondering, isn't this lounge supposed to be exclusive?" the woman said, her voice dripping with condescension. She wasn't exactly shouting, but she wasn't being discreet either. The lounge attendant, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, looked momentarily taken aback. "Yes, ma'am. This is the VIP lounge," she responded politely, though her tone was cautious, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Well, then," the woman continued, her voice rising just a little, "I find it strange that some people in here don't seem to meet that standard." Alyssa's heart sank as she realized the woman was talking about them. Marcus had heard it too. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening, but Alyssa quickly placed her hand on his arm, a silent plea for calm. She could already feel the tension rising. The last thing they needed was a confrontation, especially in front of the kids. "What do you mean?" the attendant asked, still trying to maintain a professional tone, though it was clear she was growing uneasy. The woman leaned in closer, but her voice was still loud enough for Alyssa to catch. "I just don't think it's appropriate for a place like this to let anyone in, if you know what I mean," she said, her eyes once again glancing toward Alyssa's family. It was clear what she was implying, and Alyssa's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She could see the woman's intention behind every word. The coded language, the looks, she had experienced this before, though it never got easier. Alyssa glanced at Noah and Zoe, who were still distracted, blissfully unaware of the situation unfolding around them. She wanted to keep it that way. The lounge attendant looked uncomfortable now, her face flushed as she struggled to find the right words. "Ma'am, we allow all our guests who have the proper access to use this lounge," she said, her voice growing firmer. "Everyone here is welcome." The woman rolled her eyes and made a dismissive noise, clearly unsatisfied with the response. She turned away from the desk, muttering something under her breath that Alyssa couldn't quite hear, though she could guess the general gist of it. As the woman walked past them, her heels clicking against the polished floor, she shot a glance at Alyssa's family. This time, there was no mistaking the disdain in her eyes. Alyssa felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing through a million responses. Should she say something? Should she stand up for her family? Or would that just escalate the situation? Marcus shifted beside her, his expression unreadable, though Alyssa could tell he was wrestling with the same questions. Noah, sensing the tension, finally looked up from the window. "Mom, are we going to board soon?" he asked innocently. Alyssa smiled at him, but it felt forced. "Soon, honey," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. She wouldn't let this woman ruin their trip. She wouldn't give her the satisfaction. But as the woman found a seat nearby, continuing to glance in their direction with that same look of superiority, Alyssa knew this wasn't over. The atmosphere had shifted, and it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated. And when it did, Alyssa vowed to handle it with the grace and strength that her family deserved. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. But Alyssa wasn't the type to let storms sweep her away, not this time. The minutes dragged on in the VIP lounge, though it felt as if time had slowed to a crawl for Alyssa. Every second was weighed down by the tension in the air, the feeling that something more was coming. She tried her best to focus on her children, helping Zoe with her coloring book and answering Noah's endless questions about planes, but her mind kept wandering back to the woman who had so clearly made them a target. Marcus sat beside her, his hand resting on his knee, bouncing slightly with pent-up energy. He was usually the more laid-back of the two of them, but Alyssa could tell this was getting to him. His jaw was clenched, and he hadn't said a word since the woman's passive-aggressive comment at the front desk. He was trying to stay calm for the sake of the kids, but Alyssa knew Marcus well enough to see that his patience was wearing thin. And then, as if on cue, the woman decided to break the silence once again. "I still can't believe the standards in here have fallen so low," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the lounge. This time, she didn't bother pretending to speak privately. She wanted to be heard. Alyssa's heart sank. She hoped this would pass, that maybe the woman would leave them alone after her initial remarks, but clearly, that wasn't going to happen. Alyssa glanced at Marcus, who had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the magazine he wasn't really reading. She could feel the anger radiating off him, though he was still trying his best to contain it. "We've paid good money for access to this lounge, and now they're just letting anyone in," the woman continued, her tone dripping with contempt. "What's the point of having an exclusive space if it's not exclusive anymore?" Alyssa felt her stomach twist into knots. She knew exactly what the woman meant by anyone. It wasn't just about money, it wasn't just about privilege, it was about who belonged, and in the woman's eyes, they didn't. The subtlety of her first remark had disappeared. Now, the words were blunt, pointed, and meant to wound. Zoe, who had been coloring quietly, looked up at Alyssa with wide eyes. "Mommy, who's she talking about?" she asked innocently. Alyssa forced a smile, trying to keep her voice light. "Don't worry about it, sweetie. She's just being loud." But inside, Alyssa was seething. Her children didn't need to hear this. They didn't need to witness this kind of hate. She had spent years raising them to be kind, compassionate people who treated everyone with respect, and here was this woman, this stranger, trying to chip away at their sense of belonging. Alyssa took a deep breath, trying to decide how to handle this. Confrontation wasn't her style, but she also knew that staying silent in the face of this kind of behavior wasn't an option. If she didn't say something, this woman would think it was okay to keep talking like this, to keep treating people like they were less than human. And Alyssa wasn't going to let that happen, not in front of her kids. Before Alyssa could gather her thoughts, Marcus spoke up. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone he used when he was trying to keep his temper in check. "We're just here, minding our business. If you have a problem, maybe you should leave." The woman turned her head sharply, her eyes narrowing as she looked directly at Marcus. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with false innocence. "I wasn't talking to you." Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, but we both know who you were talking about." Alyssa placed her hand on Marcus' arm, trying to calm him down, but she didn't stop him. He had every right to stand up for their family, and she wasn't going to silence him. Still, the last thing she wanted was for things to escalate in front of their kids. The woman let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head. "You people always want to play the victim, don't you?" she said, her voice now cold and sharp. "You're always looking for something to be offended by." Alyssa's pulse quickened. She had heard this kind of rhetoric before, the idea that standing up for yourself, for your dignity, was somehow playing a victim. The idea that people who spoke out against discrimination were just looking for attention, rather than fighting for their right to be treated like human beings. Alyssa knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let this woman tear them down or make them feel small. She took a deep breath, then stood up, turning to face the woman directly. "We're not playing anything," Alyssa said, her voice steady. "We're here, just like you. We belong here, just like you." The woman blinked, clearly not expecting Alyssa to stand up for herself. But her surprise quickly gave way to a sneer. "Do you? Because it doesn't seem like you belong." Alyssa felt a flash of anger, but she kept her composure. "We're not going to let you make us feel like we don't belong," she said, her voice rising just enough to be heard by the few people sitting nearby. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. We paid for access to this lounge, and we have every right to be here." The woman opened her mouth to retort, but before she could say anything, one of the lounge staff members approached, clearly sensing that the situation was escalating. She was the same young woman who had checked the family in earlier, her face now filled with concern. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, glancing nervously between Alyssa, Marcus, and the woman. The woman let out another dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes. "I was just trying to enjoy some peace and quiet," she said, her voice full of mock innocence, "but clearly, some people don't know how to behave in a space like this." Alyssa's hands clenched into fists at her sides. This woman was twisting the situation, trying to make it look like they were the problem. But before she could say anything, Marcus spoke up again. "We're not the ones causing a scene," he said, his voice firm. "We were just sitting here, minding our own business, and she decided we didn't belong." The young staff member looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Marcus and the woman, clearly unsure of what to do. But before she could respond, the woman scoffed. "I didn't say they didn't belong," she said, though the look on her face told a different story. "I just don't think it's fair that people who clearly don't appreciate this kind of space are allowed in." Alyssa couldn't take it anymore. She was done with the subtle insults, the coded language, the hateful glances. Her kids deserved better than this. They all did. "Enough," Alyssa said, her voice low but steady. "You need to stop." The entire lounge seemed to hold its breath, caught in the suffocating tension between Alyssa's family and the woman. Conversations had quieted to hushed whispers, and a few other guests were now glancing in their direction, clearly sensing that something uncomfortable was unfolding. It was one of those moments that felt frozen in time, as if the room itself had turned its attention to the conflict and was waiting to see how it would play out. Alyssa stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart pounding in her chest. She had already said her piece, had made it clear that they belonged here just as much as anyone else. But the woman still sat across from them, her face twisted into a look of smug satisfaction, as if she had somehow won by simply continuing to spew her hateful words. No one had yet moved to stop her, and that stung the most. Alyssa knew that not everyone would openly agree with the woman's views, but the silence in the room was just as hurtful. It was as if the other guests didn't want to get involved, choosing instead to stay quiet and avoid the confrontation entirely. The young lounge attendant who had tried to intervene earlier still stood nearby, her face flushed with nervousness, clearly out of her depth. She glanced helplessly at Alyssa and Marcus, unsure of how to proceed, but before she could say anything more, a new figure entered the scene. From the far end of the lounge, a man in a sharp, dark suit walked toward them with purpose. His expression was calm, but there was a certain authority in the way he carried himself that immediately commanded attention. Alyssa guessed that this was the lounge manager. As he approached, the woman, still sitting with her back straight and her chin held high, seemed to notice him too. Her face softened slightly, as if she expected him to take her side, to validate her complaints. She leaned back in her seat, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. The manager stopped just in front of them, his eyes taking in the scene, his gaze flicking briefly from Alyssa's family to the woman who had caused all this trouble. He spoke with a calm, measured voice, addressing the woman directly. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" The woman didn't waste a second. "Yes, actually, there is," she said, her voice taking on that familiar tone of entitlement. "I've been trying to explain that this lounge is supposed to be exclusive, and yet some people," she gestured toward Alyssa's family with a dismissive wave of her hand, "don't seem to understand that." The manager's expression didn't change. He listened politely, his hands folded in front of him, but Alyssa could see something shift in his eyes. It wasn't the look of someone who was about to side with this woman, but rather the look of someone who had dealt with this kind of situation before, someone who knew exactly how to handle it. "I see," the manager said after a pause. He turned his attention briefly to Alyssa and Marcus, acknowledging them with a nod, before looking back at the woman. "Ma'am, we pride ourselves on providing a welcoming and inclusive environment for all of our guests. Everyone here has equal access to the lounge, regardless of their background." Alyssa felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she didn't let it show just yet. She knew this wasn't over, but the fact that the manager had chosen his words so carefully, had spoken directly to the issue of equality, gave her a sense of validation she hadn't expected. The woman, on the other hand, was clearly not happy with this response. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of indignation. "But I'm a paying member," she protested, her voice rising with frustration. "I expect a certain level of exclusivity in a space like this, Anne." The manager didn't let her finish. His voice was still calm, but now there was a firm edge to it. "And that level of exclusivity does not, and never will, include discrimination or disrespect toward other guests. If you feel uncomfortable in this environment, I'm afraid that's something you'll need to address within yourself." The woman's mouth fell open in shock. She stared at the manager as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Excuse me? Are you suggesting that I leave?" The manager didn't blink. "I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm telling you that if you continue to make other guests feel unwelcome, I will have no choice but to ask you to leave the lounge." Alyssa almost couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had expected the manager to de-escalate the situation, maybe offer some vague apology and ask everyone to move on, but this was different. He was taking a stand. He was drawing a line and making it clear that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The woman's face had turned a deep shade of red. She sputtered, clearly at a loss for words, before finally managing to speak. "I can't believe this. I'm being treated like a criminal for simply pointing out what should be obvious." The manager's tone remained even. "No one is treating you like a criminal, ma'am. But we do have a code of conduct in this lounge, and that includes treating all of our guests with respect and dignity. If you're unable to follow that, then I will have to ask you to leave." Alyssa could see the woman's resolve cracking. For the first time since this entire ordeal had started, she looked genuinely uncertain of what to do. She had expected to be supported, to have her complaints validated, but instead, she was being told, very clearly, that she was the one in the wrong. She huffed, gathering her coat and bag, still trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "This is outrageous," she muttered under her breath. "I won't be coming back here." The manager simply nodded. "That's your decision, ma'am. But I'm going to have to ask you to leave for today." With that, the woman shot one last glare at Alyssa and Marcus before turning on her heel and marching toward the exit. The silence that followed was thick, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't the suffocating tension of earlier, it was a silence of relief, of closure. As the woman disappeared through the doors, Alyssa let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand, his expression softening for the first time since the whole ordeal began. The manager turned back to Alyssa and her family, his face now warm and sincere. "I apologize for the way that guest treated you," he said. "That kind of behavior is not acceptable here, or anywhere." Alyssa nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say, but the gratitude she felt was overwhelming. After everything that had happened, after feeling like they were being attacked for simply existing, someone had finally stepped in and taken a stand. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with appreciation. "It means a lot that you did that." The manager smiled. "It's the least we could do. Please enjoy the rest of your time here. If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask." With that, he gave them one final nod and walked away, leaving Alyssa and Marcus to process what had just happened. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate as the other guests resumed their quiet conversations, though a few still glanced over at them with looks of sympathy and support. Alyssa sat back down, her heart still racing but her mind slowly beginning to settle. It wasn't over, not really. These kinds of encounters left marks, even when they ended in resolution. But for now, at least, they could breathe again. Noah, who had been unusually quiet throughout the entire ordeal, looked up at Alyssa with wide eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "why was that lady so mean to us?" Alyssa felt her chest tighten. She had known this question would come eventually, but hearing it from her son's innocent voice made it all the more painful. "She just didn't understand, sweetie," Alyssa said gently. "But what's important is that we know we belong here, no matter what anyone says." Zoe, who had been focused on her coloring book, looked up too. "She left," Zoe said matter-of-factly, as if that was all that mattered. Alyssa smiled, reaching over to brush a strand of hair from Zoe's face. "Yes, she did." And for the first time that day, Alyssa truly felt like everything was going to be okay. The hum of the lounge resumed its usual rhythm, but for Alyssa, the world felt like it had slowed down. The intense rush of emotions, the tension that had gripped her chest, was slowly beginning to ebb away. The woman was gone, but the sting of her words lingered like the echo of a bad dream. It was over, yet Alyssa couldn't shake the heaviness that had settled in her bones. Marcus, ever the steady anchor in her life, gently squeezed her hand again. His presence always brought her comfort, but she could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing on both of them. They had weathered the storm, but not without cost. Alyssa glanced at Noah and Zoe. Their children had handled the situation with more resilience than she expected, but she could see the confusion in their eyes. They didn't fully understand the ugliness they had witnessed, and for that, she was both relieved and heartbroken. The world was supposed to be a place where kids felt safe, where they didn't have to question whether or not they belonged. But here they were, at the airport, on the cusp of a family vacation, being taught a hard lesson about the world. As Alyssa's thoughts churned, the same lounge manager who had intervened earlier returned, walking toward them with the same calm demeanor. This time, however, there was no tension, only an air of resolution. "Excuse me again," he began, stopping just a few feet from their table. His expression was sincere, with a hint of empathy that hadn't been there before. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you're all doing okay after what happened." Alyssa exchanged a quick glance with Marcus before answering. We're fine, I think," she said, though her voice was softer than she intended. "It's been a lot to process." The manager nodded, as though he fully understood. "I can't imagine how upsetting that was," he said, his voice full of genuine sympathy. "I'm deeply sorry for what you had to experience here. That kind of behavior has no place in this lounge, or anywhere, really." The sincerity of his words caught Alyssa off guard. She had half expected the situation to end the way most public incidents did, an intervention, a removal, and then an awkward silence. But this apology felt different. It wasn't just an obligatory gesture, it felt like a genuine acknowledgement of the hurt that had been caused. And it wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about recognizing the humanity in her family and making it clear that they mattered. Alyssa took a deep breath, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She wasn't usually one to get emotional in public, but the weight of the situation, combined with the manager's unexpected compassion, brought a rush of feeling she hadn't anticipated. She blinked quickly, trying to compose herself. "Thank you," Marcus said, stepping in as Alyssa collected her thoughts. His voice was calm but carried the weight of the day's events. "It means a lot that you stepped in. We weren't sure how it was going to go, but we appreciate it." The manager gave a small, understanding smile. "I'm just glad we were able to resolve it before it escalated further. No one should have to deal with that kind of treatment, especially not when you're here to relax before a trip." There was a brief pause, and then the manager leaned in slightly, his voice lowering just enough to make the moment feel more personal. "You'd be surprised how often we see situations like this," he said quietly. "But that doesn't make it right. And it doesn't make it any less painful when it happens." Alyssa nodded, her throat still tight. It's hard. We try to stay positive, to not let things like this affect us, but," she trailed off, not quite sure how to articulate the complex emotions swirling inside her. "How do you explain to a stranger the exhaustion that comes with navigating a world where people see you as less than, simply because of the color of your skin?" The manager seemed to sense what she was struggling to say. He didn't rush her or try to fill the silence with platitudes. Instead, he simply nodded, offering them the space to process everything at their own pace. "I know I can't undo what happened," the manager said gently, "but if there's anything else we can do to make your experience more comfortable, please let me know." Alyssa managed a small, appreciative smile. "You've already done more than we expected," she said softly. "Thank you." The manager nodded again, his expression kind but professional. "Well, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out." He took a small step back, preparing to leave, but then added, "And just so you know, the rest of your stay here is fully on the house. It's the least we can do after what you've been through." Alyssa blinked in surprise, not expecting the gesture. "Oh, no, that's not necessary," she began, but the manager held up a hand, stopping her gently. "I insist," he said with a smile. "It's a small gesture, but we hope it helps you feel welcome and valued here. Your family deserves to start your vacation on the right note." Alyssa didn't argue further. Instead, she simply nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't about the free amenities or the cost, this was about being seen, about being acknowledged in a world that so often chose to ignore or diminish their experience. As the manager walked away, Alyssa finally exhaled, feeling some of the weight lift off her shoulders. The room, which had felt stifling just minutes ago, seemed a little lighter now. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. She looked over at Marcus, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Alyssa nodded, though her emotions still swirled just beneath the surface. "Yeah. I think I am." Zoe, still absorbed in her coloring book, seemed blissfully unaware of the emotional heaviness hanging over the table. But Noah, who had been quietly watching everything, broke the silence with the kind of simple, innocent question only a child could ask. "Why was she so mad at us?" he asked, his eyes wide and full of confusion. Alyssa felt her heart squeeze in her chest. It was a question she knew would come, but it didn't make it any easier to answer. She glanced at Marcus, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to take the lead. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, people don't understand that everyone is different," she said softly. "And when they don't understand, they can be mean. But that doesn't mean we're wrong for being who we are. We belong here, just like anyone else." Noah furrowed his brow, clearly trying to process her words. "So, she was wrong?" Alyssa smiled gently, reaching over to smooth his hair. "Yes, sweetie. She was wrong." Noah nodded slowly, as if he was still turning the idea over in his mind. Then, in typical 10-year-old fashion, he shrugged and turned back to his tablet, as if the whole ordeal had been filed away in some distant part of his brain. Alyssa sighed softly, grateful for her son's resilience but still saddened that he had to ask those kinds of questions in the first place. It was a reminder of the world they lived in, the challenges they would continue to face as a family. But as she looked around the lounge, at the quiet murmur of conversation, at the staff who had stood up for them, at the small, comforting gestures that followed the storm, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. In this moment, they weren't just tolerated. They were seen. And that made all the difference. As the minutes ticked by and the atmosphere in the lounge gradually returned to its usual, peaceful calm, Alyssa couldn't help but feel like something had shifted. It wasn't just the relief of the woman being asked to leave or the comfort of the manager's kind words, it was something deeper, a realization that even in moments of ugliness and adversity, there could be beauty in how people stood up for each other. For so long, Alyssa had been used to brushing off comments, shrugging them away with a forced smile for the sake of her children. She had become skilled at pretending those moments didn't cut as deeply as they did, hoping that if she stayed calm and silent, the storm would pass. But today had been different. Today, something inside her had shifted, and she was proud of herself for standing up, not just for her own dignity, but for her family's. She glanced at Marcus, who was still sitting beside her, flipping through his phone now that things had calmed down. His face had relaxed, and the tension in his shoulders had disappeared, replaced by that familiar ease she loved. He caught her looking at him and gave her a small smile, one that told her he was proud too. "Pretty intense morning for a vacation, huh?" Marcus said, his tone light but carrying an undercurrent of sincerity. He reached over and gently tapped her knee, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Alyssa chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Definitely not how I expected things to go," she admitted, her voice soft. "But I'm glad we didn't just sit there and let it happen." Marcus nodded in agreement. "You were amazing," he said, his voice low. "The way you stood up to her. I could see the kids watching you. That's what they'll remember, not her words." Alyssa felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't always easy to see the impact of these moments in the middle of them, but hearing Marcus say it out loud made it feel real. She hadn't just defended herself, she had shown Noah and Zoe the importance of standing tall, even when the world tried to make you feel small. As if on cue, Zoe hopped down from her chair, abandoning her coloring book, and crawled into Alyssa's lap. Her small arms wrapped around Alyssa's waist as she snuggled in close, clearly seeking the comfort only her mother could provide. Zoe's innocence and simplicity in seeking affection was like a balm to Alyssa's heart, a reminder that her children were still young enough to find solace in her arms, but wise enough to notice when something was wrong. "Mommy, can we still go to the beach when we get to Miami?" Zoe asked, her voice muffled as she pressed her cheek against Alyssa's chest. Alyssa smiled, her fingers running through Zoe's curls. "Of course we can," she said softly. "We're going to have the best time ever." Zoe pulled back slightly, her wide eyes peering up at Alyssa with complete trust. "You're the best mommy," she said matter-of-factly, as if there was no room for debate on the matter. Then she grinned, her small, gap-toothed smile lighting up her face. "And I love the beach." Alyssa laughed, her heart swelling with affection. "I love the beach too, baby," she said, squeezing Zoe tightly. Noah, ever the curious and thoughtful one, glanced up from his tablet. He had been unusually quiet since the incident, but Alyssa could see the wheels turning in his mind. Noah was the kind of kid who absorbed everything, processing it slowly and carefully before speaking up. She knew he was still thinking about what had happened. "Mom," he said, his voice more serious than usual. "Why do people act like that?" It was a question Alyssa had hoped wouldn't come, but she wasn't surprised to hear it. Noah was too observant not to have picked up on the deeper layers of what had happened. She exchanged a glance with Marcus, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. This was one of those moments as a parent when you had to be honest, but also careful with your words. Alyssa took a deep breath, pulling Noah's chair a little closer to hers so they could speak more quietly. "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully, "sometimes people treat others badly because they're afraid of things they don't understand. They might think that because someone looks different or has a different life than them, they don't belong. But that's not true." Noah furrowed his brow, clearly trying to make sense of what she was saying. "So she didn't like us because we're different?" Alyssa nodded slowly. "That's right. But being different isn't a bad thing. It's what makes the world interesting. And it's important to remember that no matter what anyone says, we all belong wherever we choose to be." Noah was quiet for a moment, processing her words. Then, with the simplicity and wisdom of a child, he shrugged and said, "Well, that lady was wrong. I like us." Alyssa's heart swelled with pride. "I like us too," she said with a smile. Marcus chuckled softly, reaching over to ruffle Noah's hair. "You're right, buddy. We're pretty awesome." The family sat together for a few more minutes, letting the quiet settle over them like a warm blanket. The lounge, which had once felt like a battleground, now felt peaceful again. The tension had faded, and in its place was a sense of calm, a reminder that despite the ugliness they had just faced, they were still standing, still together, and still looking forward to the adventures ahead. As boarding time approached, Alyssa gathered their belongings and helped Zoe and Noah get their things together. The rest of the lounge staff continued their usual duties, occasionally glancing over at the family with polite smiles. Alyssa noticed that some of the other guests, who had been silent during the incident, now gave them nods of acknowledgement, small gestures that, while subtle, felt meaningful. When the family finally made their way to the boarding gate, Alyssa felt a lightness she hadn't expected. The events of the morning had been draining, but in the end, they had emerged stronger. They had faced hate with grace, stood their ground, and shown their children the power of resilience. As they walked down the jet bridge, Alyssa took one last look back at the lounge, the place where it had all unfolded. She felt a sense of closure, not because the experience had been easy, but because they had gotten through it as a family. And in that, there was something deeply healing. Once seated on the plane, with Zoe happily settled by the window and Noah already engrossed in a new game on his tablet, Alyssa leaned her head against Marcus' shoulder. The familiar hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as they prepared for takeoff, the promise of their long-awaited vacation finally within reach. "Miami, here we come," Marcus said with a grin, leaning over to kiss the top of Alyssa's head. Alyssa smiled, closing her eyes for a moment and allowing herself to fully relax. The sun would be waiting for them in Miami, along with the ocean, the laughter, and the joy they had been dreaming of. And though the morning had been difficult, it hadn't broken them. If anything, it had brought them closer. As the plane lifted into the sky, Alyssa's heart soared with it. They were heading into the future, and no matter what challenges they faced, she knew they would face them together. And that was all she needed. Thanks for being part of our storytelling journey. If this tale resonated with you, don't miss out on the next adventure, just click the video now. We value your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.